when I first started out studying local history, I assumed that all the street names in the town of Monrovia from 1886 were assigned by the Monrovia Land and Water Company. With the naming scheme for the east-west streets of trees, actually citrus trees, or let's say fruit-bearing trees that would have been under cultivation. And that the north-south trees were named for, north-south streets were named for trees or flowers, with the exception of ivy, myrtle, and Charlotte. Myrtle, of course, named for Myrtle Monroe, William Monroe's elder daughter, and Charlotte named for a daughter of Colonel Samuel Kiefer, one of Monroe's business associates.
But there is a crepe myrtle tree, which we have all over town.
There are.
Is there also a myrtle tree?
Well, the crepe myrtle is Monrovia's official tree,
Oh.
just as the iris is Monrovia's official flower.
Hmm.
Now, those choices were made later on. As an aside, during the 1932 Olympics in Los Angeles, Monrovia went through a beautification process where they urged people to plant petunias. And they did, and apparently in great numbers. And for a while, Monrovia was referred to as Petunia City, USA. It didn't get adopted as a city flower, but anyway. It was an interesting effort and probably attracted some nice attention to Monrovia, and that implemented that theme. But later on, when I started studying the origins of Monrovia, I realized that some of the street names came from Lucky Baldwin's 1883 subdivision of the eastern portion of Rancho Santa Anita, and those street names were White Oak, Orange, Falling Leaf. So I don't know if the founders, if that might have been a suggestion that they then used in their naming schemes of the new streets, east, west, and northwest streets of Monrovia. It might have been, but there was a theme behind it, that's for sure. So the original streets in the town of Monrovia, the town site, were Lime, Lemon, and Orange, which already existed, and then Olive and Walnut. And of course, the east to the north, the west to east, Magnolia, Primrose. I mentioned Myrtle, Ivy, and Charlotte. As the additions began to be made to Monrovia, in a general sense, they followed the original naming scheme. Those new subdivisions that were aligned with the original streets simply extended those existing streets through the new subdivisions, maintaining the new name, or maintaining the original name. The addition number 1 to the Monrovia tract introduced Grand Avenue, primarily because it had a nice sweep to it as it went through the tract. One of the streets, east-west streets, was Prospect, because from that street looking over the San Gabriel Valley, you did in fact have a wonderful prospect of the valley. Hill Street, because going north from Greystone, you indeed went up quite a steep hill. In fact, if you were learning how to drive, Hill was a great place with a stick shift to learn how to get yourself in gear on a hill. Granite was part of that subdivision. I'm trying to think of some of the others. Greystone, I'm not sure about.
There's heliotrope and a few charming
Sure.
names
And
over.
that was part of the Pacific View tract that was opened up in probably about August of 1887, immediately east of the Grand View, which was an addition but maintained the same street naming theme that was already in place.
And Daffodil?
So when it started, what we now know as California was Daffodil, followed by Jasmine, heliotrope, and shamrock. Wild rose already existed as part of the Grandview subdivision, and then on the south of the tract, it was lime and lemon, which already existed as extensions of the original town site.
And banana?
Some point daffodil, probably because daffodil went all the way to Huntington Drive or Falling Leaf. There was a very slight jog, and then California, which is an existing street name, began at that point. I think in the interest of continuity, daffodil was dropped and it became named California throughout. Jasmine, heliotrope, and shamrock, of course, have survived to the present time. One of the streets put into place by the Monroe edition was Banana. There are great early pictures showing banana trees growing along Banana Avenue. My understanding is it was to demonstrate that that area of Monrovia was so temperate because of its elevation that you could successfully grow banana trees and produce bananas as a fruit. Any other street names? The southwest part of Monrovia, starting at Mayflower on the west, starting at 5th on the west, continuing to Mayflower on the east. That area might have been part of Lucky Baldwin's Arcadia, but if not, it incorporated the street names in Lucky Baldwin's Arcadia tract. The east-west streets were named using letters of the alphabet. It was Alta, Bonita, Crystal, Diamond, El Dorado, and Fano. And then the north-south streets were continuations of 5th. There was a 5th, a 7th, 8th, 9th, and a 10th. I think there might even have been an 11th. Someplace probably in the teens, when things were being renamed to reflect an Hispanic heritage, they selected, and not necessarily in order, Alamitas, Monterey, Loma, Alta, El Dorado. Those replaced the named, the numbered streets. I think that C instead of Crystal became California. I'd have to check on the map. Anyway, the east-west streets primarily remained as originally named, but the north-south ones were renamed after Spanish place names or Spanish-inspired names. Studebaker Addition had a north-south street that was named Center. I believe that's now Avocado Place. On the east was a Studebaker, or west, anyway, one that's now El Nido because of the way it aligned with El Nido a little further south, or the house at the very top, which was called El Nido, or the Nest, because it clung to the side of the hill. Maybe that was what inspired El Nido being renamed that instead of whatever name it had previously. Might have been Prospect, and that might have been changed to avoid confusion with the Prospect in the eastern part of Monrovia. No recent street name changes, although Royal Oaks has a second name of Bob Bartlett Way to honor former mayor and prime mover Bob Bartlett. Duarte Road has had 4 different names that I'm aware of. It started out as being known as the County Road. Then by 1904, it was Santa Fe. A little later, it was Maine. And then finally, it became Duarte Road. What we know as Royal Oaks Drive was originally Duarte Avenue. It was probably renamed Royal Oaks, number 1, because there were oak trees planted along it. but also to avoid confusion against Duarte Road, the former county road, Santa Fe, Maine.
What about the streets named for presidents?
Good point. That area was probably developed in the teens or 20s, and that produced a McKinley, a Garfield, a Madison, and a Lincoln. And in some cases, I believe it was Lincoln that was originally called 6th to reflect the street naming a little further south, renamed. I don't know if there was a 7th or an 8th north of Foothill, but I know there was a 6th and that was renamed Lincoln.
So I don't know if you added primrose. Primrose is one of the flowering, is that a flower or?
It's a small flower.
And then palm
Right.
and fig all follow this sort of
Right.
growing.
So those names were original in the eastern part of Monrovia. There was a Sherman and Pinney's addition. Sherman Avenue still exists, although part of it's been abbreviated to accommodate the redevelopment along Huntington Drive. But the east-west street names were Date, Plum, and Fig. I believe Fig is still there as a street name. Plum might have been renamed Los Angeles. And Date no longer exists. I believe it's changed also. Then there was Cypress Avenue
And evergreen.
and Evergreen, which came in later. Central might have come from Duarte. I'm not sure. What other ones can you think of?
Well, down by the packing plant, by the depot,
Yeah.
the San Francisco
So-
names.
L.L. Bradbury was behind the Bradbury addition, and he selected his own street names with the exception of Myrtle. I've looked at them, and I can't quote them from memory, but they suggest San Francisco street names. There were 2 street names that survived. One is Railroad Avenue, parallel to the train tracks, one was maybe half a block north of the tracks themselves, and then Raymond, which is a very short street that runs south from Pomona and tees into Railroad Avenue. Those are the only 2 that I can think of that are left.
Where did the name Pomona come from? Who knows?
I don't know. It doesn't lead to Pomona, but somebody liked Pomona, so it became named that.
And what used to be Orange is what is now Colorado, or did it? You said Colorado was a.
It was Orange until it was aligned with the eastern extension of Colorado from Pasadena. And once the extension was collected, they renamed it Colorado to reflect the fact that it was on the west was aligned with Colorado Boulevard from Pasadena passing through Arcadia.
And did you say that was one of the leftovers from the Lucky Baldwin?
It was. That was part of the 1883 street naming scheme. Falling Leaf became Huntington Drive again when Huntington Drive out from Los Angeles was aligned with it. The street name took place. The street name change took place.
And when did Banana become Hillcrest?
Probably about 1911. I think it's still Banana in the 1908-1909 Monrovia City Directory, but I believe by either 1911 or 1913, the name change had taken place.
When did JIC become Alta Vista?
About the same time. Again, that reflects that fascination with the Hispanic heritage of using that for street naming. Earlier, that had been used in naming 2 streets, Valley Vista and Sierra Vista. Sierra Vista being a very short street. Valley Vista being initially maybe several blocks long, but after that part of Monrovia was developed, it was extended to the north until it ran into Norumbega Drive. And then speaking of Norumbega, the original East Avenue in 1883 was what we now know as Mayflower. Then, when the Monroe addition went in and Mayflower had been renamed, Norumbega was named East Avenue because it was on the eastern boundary between Ranchos Azusa de Duarte and Rancho Santa Anita. Its alignment is northeast by southwest because that's what the Rancho boundary alignment was. At some point in the early teens, the Norumbega Heights tract was put on the market. Land was purchased, subdivided, and a winding roadway through the tract, Norumbega Drive, was put in. At some point, it was aligned with the former East Avenue. And then again, because of the alignment, the East Avenue name was dropped and it became Norumbega Drive throughout.
Where did the name Foothill come from? Because it's a long street goes.
It was part of, I think, it might have started about 1909 when the California State Legislature put into place a fairly complex program of highway development and identified a number of routes, like 2 and 101, not 101, but 1, 2, 118 route was established then. And the idea was that there would be this boulevard running along the foothills that started about maybe Sylmar and went all the way east to San Bernardino. So the alignment Monrovia was on the former White Oak. So as it was widened, as White Oak was widened from 2 lanes to 4, a process that started in the mid-1920s and continued for several years thereafter. Interestingly enough, as soon as it was widened to 4 lanes, it became Foothill, and the sections that were still 2 lanes were still called White Oak, even though it was the same street. If you look at the 1927 directory, for example, in the section in the rear having to do with streets and addresses, they'll identify White Oak as being west from Mayflower to the city limits, and then they'll say Foothill east from Mayflower to Shamrock, and then Foothill east of Shamrock, because it was still 2 lanes, was still White Oak. Anyway, it was a complex process of changing over based on the street widening. But I think the name originated with that 1909 legislative act where they were identifying major transportation routes throughout California.
Okay, so that's in general how the streets got their names in
general,
Monrovia.
right. Wild Rose, I've seen on the 1887 map of the Pacific View Tract, Wild Rose being spelled as 2 words with an E on the wild. And I thought, could that be a reference to John Wilde? Or could it be somebody's idea of let's be quaint and use Old English spelling? Anyway, just a thought. Never seen anything in writing that would indicate it might be linked somehow to John Wilde.
And a little double entendre with the flowering
Yes,
plant.
Ye Old Blooming Rose, or whatever, right. Ye Old Wild Rose. The Ocean View, the Oak Park Tract went on the market in 1906 by C.E. Slauson, outside the Monrovia city limits, was not incorporated within the limits until probably in the 1920s. That added 3 street names, actually in geographical order. The first is Ocean View, then Valley View, then Mountain View. And then on the north it was bounded by Oak Park Lane, which was an eastern extension of Greystone Avenue. When Greystone was extended in the 1950s through the former Grandin estate, the Oak Park name was dropped and it became Greystone throughout. With the exception of some more recent street name additions, there always was a reason behind the naming scheme. Started perhaps by Lucky Baldwin's surveyor, certainly continued by the Monrovia Land and Water Company as they put the new Monrovia, town of Monrovia on the map, continued by subsequent developers, and even followed in the early 1900s by using specific naming schemes to name new streets.